The stars had always looked like a promise, but tonight they looked like a warning. A silent ocean stretched across the sky, its endless lights watching, unblinking as if waiting for humanity to make its choice. The first world, Earth, the only home humans had ever known, was no longer just a cradle of life. It had become a beacon. And beacons drew attention, want it or not. The story begins not in the future of shining towers and peace, but in the raw uncertainty of survival. Generations had looked up at the heavens and asked what might be out there. Now that question had been answered, and it was not what anyone hoped for. Humanity was not alone. But it was not welcomed either. The first encounter did not come with peace offerings. It came with shadows, vast ships blotting out the sun over the oceans, their size enough to dwarf entire cities. Humanity watched them descend with awe, fear, and a strange, stubborn defiance. They were not gods. They were not saviors. They were something far older, something that looked at Earth not as a world of lives, but as territory. And territory could be taken. That was the moment everything changed. Earth was no longer only Earth, it was the first world. The world that carried humanity's first breath, the soil that held every grave, the place written into every song, story, and scar. It was the one place humanity could not afford to lose. The Guardians did not begin as heroes. They were ordinary men and women, scattered across cities and fields, soldiers, scientists, wanderers, and dreamers. They had no grand design, no single leader to guide them. What they had was something their enemies underestimated, an unbroken thread of memory, of belonging, of fierce love for the place they called home. It wasn't technology that shaped them at first. Their ships were slower, their weapons weaker, their numbers smaller. What they carried instead was will. The will to endure when every statistic said they shouldn't. The will to rise when they were knocked down. The will to guard what no one else could, because if Earth fell, humanity fell with it. At first the world split. Some wanted to bow, to bend the knee and survive under alien rule. Others wanted to fight to the last man. The argument tore families apart. Cities burned not just from the sky but from within. Yet in the ashes of that division, something stronger began to take shape. Humanity was many things, fragile, divided, reckless. But when pushed to the edge, it had always found a way to stand together. The Guardians came from that fire. They were not chosen, they were forged. Every one of them bore scars. Losses that could not be replaced, promises that could never be fulfilled. But they carried those wounds like weapons, reminders of what was at stake. The first battle was not won. It wasn't even close. The sky rained fire, the oceans turned black, and cities were reduced to ruins. But the Guardians learned. They adapted faster than their enemies expected. Every defeat became a lesson. Every loss carved into them a sharper edge. They stopped being prey and began to strike back. Yet even as they rose, a darker truth loomed. The enemy had not come for war alone. They came for something hidden, something buried deep within the first world itself. Something even humanity had forgotten. And if they took it, Earth would not just be conquered, it would be erased. That secret whispered through broken transmissions and half-deciphered alien messages. It lay beneath mountains, beneath oceans, beneath the very bedrock of the planet. It was older than humanity, older than language, and yet tied to the fate of the species. The first world was not just Earth. It was a vault. A beginning. A truth too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. And so the Guardians became more than defenders. They became keepers of a mystery that could decide the future of every world, not just their own. The line they drew was not simply for survival, but for meaning. For the right of humanity to define itself, not to be defined by others. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of that secret. Every battle cost them more than they could afford. And yet they kept moving forward. Not because they believed they could win, but because they could not accept losing. The skies grew darker with enemy fleets. The ground shook with battles that seemed endless. The oceans churned with fire and steel. Yet somewhere, in the silence between the chaos, each Guardian carried a quiet oath. Asterisk, we do not let go. Not here. Not now. Not ever. Asterisk. It was not courage that made them stand. It was love, the kind that burned hotter than fear. Love for the laughter of children who deserved to grow up under a free sky. Love for the memory of parents and friends whose faces they would never see again. Love for the soil beneath their feet, the rivers that carved valleys, the forests that still whispered in the wind. Love for the first world, the only home that had ever been theirs. But even love had its price. And the higher they climbed, the heavier the weight became. Each Guardian knew that before the end came, many of them would not live to see the dawn. Still they fought. Still they stood. Still they carried the secret closer to its revelation. And then, Just when the war's outcome seemed certain, when humanity had begun to believe they might actually turn the tide, something new stirred in the depths of the First World. Something no one was ready for. The ground split open. The skies flickered with light that no weapon had made. The enemy ships stopped their assault, as if even they feared what was waking. The Guardians looked on, breath held, hearts pounding, realizing that the true battle had only just begun. And somewhere in that silence, between fear and hope, a single question cut through every mind. What if the First World itself was never truly theirs? The ground did not stop shaking for hours after the light split the horizon. People gathered in ruined streets, their faces lit by a glow that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. The Guardians stood among them, unsure whether to call it salvation or the beginning of something worse. The enemy had halted, their ships hanging still in the skies, but silence was not safety. Silence was a question, and the First World had just whispered an answer no one understood. The Guardians were scattered across the planet, but each of them felt the same unease. For years they had believed their battle was simple. Defend Earth, protect humanity, drive back the invaders who wanted to strip their home bare. But this awakening beneath the soil, shifted everything. The war was not just about territory anymore. It was about something hidden, something the enemy seemed to know far better than humanity did. One of the Guardians, a soldier who had already lost his family in the first bombardments, pressed his hand to the ground. It trembled under his palm, alive in a way that made his chest tighten. He had seen cities burn, watched oceans turn to smoke, but nothing unsettled him more than this sensation of the planet itself moving. He whispered a vow under his breath, one no one else heard. We will not lose her. Not the First World. Not now. The scientists among the Guardians had tried to explain what was happening. They spoke of energy signatures far beyond human technology, of ancient layers buried deep beneath the crust. They found fragments of symbols carved into bedrock, lines that matched no language known to Earth. Some called it a machine. Others called it a memory. None could agree, but all of them understood that it mattered, and that the enemy had come for this, not for land or resources. The Guardians began to dig through old records, long-forgotten texts and myths. They pieced together stories told by ancestors, fragments of legends about the First World being chosen, blessed, or cursed. What had once been dismissed as folklore now seemed to carry a warning. Maybe Earth had always been more than a planet. Maybe it had always been a key. That realization brought both fear and resolve. Humanity had never been ready for war among the stars. They had stumbled into it, outmatched and outgunned. Yet in the heart of their home, buried deeper than any weapon, was something that might balance the scales, or destroy everything they hoped to save. The Guardians felt the weight of that truth pressing on them. They were not only fighters anymore. They were caretakers of a secret older than their species. Every step they took now mattered. Every decision could tilt the future. Suspicion began to grow among them. Some believed the awakening beneath the earth was a weapon, a final gift left behind for those who came after. Others feared it was a prison, something locked away because it was too dangerous to use. The arguments grew louder, the cracks between them deeper. They were united in love for the First World, but love alone could not erase fear. The enemy, too, had not vanished. Their fleets circled, patient, watchful. They did not attack again, but their presence was a shadow across every sunrise. It was as if they, too, were waiting for the First World to finish whatever had begun. The Guardians could feel their gaze, heavy and constant, like wolves watching from the edge of firelight. In the midst of this, humanity itself struggled to survive. Families huddled in broken shelters, food scarce, air thick with smoke. The Guardians carried those burdens with them, knowing every moment they delayed meant more suffering for those they swore to protect. Yet rushing blindly toward the secret could unleash something far worse. It was a choice with no clear path forward, and every heartbeat made the weight heavier. Some nights, when the battles fell quiet and the skies held only silence, the Guardians dreamed of voices. Not the voices of their loved ones, but something older, deeper. Tones that echoed like the rumble of the earth itself. Some woke in fear. Others woke with tears on their faces, convinced they had heard the First World calling to them. None could explain it and none could deny it. The soldiers, the scientists, the wanderers who had become Guardians, they were bound not just by duty now but by something unspoken. A sense that the First World was watching them as much as they were guarding it. That the soil, the rivers, the mountains they bled for were not just pieces of land, but part of something alive. Something that had been waiting for this moment. And yet, the question hung heavier with every day. Waiting for what? The suspense was unbearable. The enemy's silence was worse than their war. The glow from the earth grew stronger, creeping across fault lines, lighting rivers from below, staining the nights with colors no human eye had ever seen before. Children pointed at the sky in wonder while their parents trembled. Even the animals grew restless, moving in strange patterns as if following some signal humans could not hear. The guardians tried to keep order, to hold the line of hope. But inside many of them were breaking. They carried grief for those lost, fear for what might come, and doubt about whether they were strong enough to face it. And still they stood. Because standing was the only choice left. Every whisper from the people, every frightened glance, every desperate plea fell onto their shoulders. They became symbols of resistance, of guardianship, not because they were flawless but because they refused to fall. And in that refusal, humanity found something to cling to. But deep beneath the earth, the pulse grew louder. The tremors stronger. The air sharper as though charged with storms yet to break. The first world was waking, and whatever it carried would not stay hidden much longer. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a guardian looked out over the ruins of a city that had once been full of life. In the distance, the glow from the cracked ground shimmered like veins of fire. He thought of the stories passed down, of ancestors who spoke of beginnings and endings. He thought of the people still alive, clinging to each other in the wreckage. He thought of the enemy ships above, waiting for the moment humanity failed. And then he whispered the only truth he knew, *, we are not ready. But we cannot run. *. The Guardians understood then that their fight was not only for Earth's soil or skies. It was for the soul of humanity itself. For the right to decide their own fate even if the cost was everything. The first world had kept its secret long enough. Now the time was coming when it would be revealed. And when it did, the question would not be whether humanity could survive, but whether it deserved to. The sky had grown darker than night, even at noon. Storms circled the planet in endless spirals, lightning tearing across the clouds in colors no one had seen before. It was as if the first world itself was caught between life and something far stranger. The Guardians watched as entire regions glowed faintly beneath the ground, lines spreading like veins across the continents. The planet was alive in ways they could not explain, and every pulse carried with it a warning: time was running out. The enemy fleets had tightened their formation. Dozens of vast ships drifted above Earth's atmosphere, unmoving as though waiting for a signal. It was not an invasion now, it was a siege. Humanity was trapped between a waking planet and an enemy strong enough to crush them in a single strike. Yet still the ships held their fire. That hesitation filled the Guardians with unease. The enemy was not afraid of humanity's defenses. They were afraid of whatever was waking beneath the soil. Each passing day stretched nerves tighter. Families clung to shelters, the glow of the earth seeping into their dreams. Children woke screaming, claiming to hear voices whispering in the cracks of stone. Animals fled inland, abandoning oceans and forests as though they knew what was coming. Even the strongest Guardians felt the weight pressing on them, an unseen force that made their hearts pound and their thoughts darken. And still they pressed forward. One group dug deep into a mountain fissure, following the light that pulsed through stone like blood through veins. What they found was not natural. Vast walls carved smooth, ancient corridors stretching deeper than any mine, and markings that seemed to hum when touched. None of it belonged to humans. None of it belonged to the invaders either. It was something else older than both. The scientists among them tried to decode the symbols, their voices shaking as they worked. Every pattern pointed to a message left behind, but the meaning slipped through their grasp. The Guardians who had lost too much already stared at the walls with fists clenched. It didn't matter what the symbols meant. What mattered was that their enemies wanted it, and that meant they could not have it. But the enemy knew too. They began to move. Fleets shifted closer, shadows blotting out stars. Dropships gathered at the edges of the atmosphere, engines burning like fireflies against the void. Humanity braced, knowing that when the first strike came, there would be no turning back. Tension gripped every corner of the first world. In cities already reduced to rubble, people whispered prayers into the smoke. In fields where nothing grew anymore, survivors buried their dead with trembling hands. And in the silence of bunkers, families held one another, hoping that the Guardians would be enough. The Guardians themselves were breaking under the weight of expectation. They carried rifles, tools, scraps of salvaged armor, but more than that, they carried the hopes of an entire species. Each of them knew that if they failed, Earth would be nothing more than a memory, its soil stripped bare, its skies empty, its people scattered like ash. And yet, doubt gnawed at them. The pulses from the ground grew stronger, shaking the air, cracking the stone. What if the secret beneath the first world was not salvation, but doom? What if unlocking it gave their enemies exactly what they wanted? The thought lingered in every mind, unspoken but heavy. To fight was one thing. To fight while not knowing if the prize itself would destroy you was another. Still, they had no choice. The first world was theirs. The only world that had ever been theirs. To abandon it now would be to abandon themselves. The night before the storm broke, silence fell across the entire planet. The wind stopped. The ocean stilled. Even the enemy fleets froze in their orbit, engines dim. The Guardians gathered, some in ruined cities, others deep underground, all bound by the same terrible stillness. They could feel it, the world holding its breath. And then it began. The ground tore open, fissures splitting across continents. Light roared upward in columns, piercing the sky, painting the clouds in burning hues. The enemy ships shifted instantly, forming a wall above the planet, weapons igniting. Humanity's defenders raised their eyes, knowing the battle they had feared for so long had finally come. The Guardians stood at the front, faces hardened with grief and fire, knowing this was the moment everything would break. They could hear the voices now, rising from beneath the earth, ancient and thunderous, carried on the pulse of stone and soil. Some voices cried in warning. Others beckoned like a promise. The fleets above loomed closer, engines screaming, weapons locking onto the surface. The Guardians lifted their weapons, every heartbeat heavy with dread and defiance. Around them, survivors clung to one another, watching their fate descend from the skies. The first world shook so violently that mountains collapsed into valleys. The oceans heaved as though something beneath them was pushing upward. A shape, vast, dark, and impossible, began to stir below the waves, its outline glowing against the depths. The enemy fired the first shot. It split the sky, a lance of fire descending toward the surface. The Guardians braced for impact, their bodies trembling with fear and fury. And in that final instant, as the beam struck the earth, the first world answered. A surge of light erupted upward, colliding with the weapon midair, shattering the darkness with brilliance. The sound was deafening, shaking every stone, rattling every bone. The enemy fleets wavered, their formation breaking. The Guardians stood frozen, eyes wide, as the truth began to emerge from beneath their feet. The first world was not just waking. It was rising. The light that had erupted from the heart of the first world should have been enough to scatter the enemy, but instead it drew them closer. Their fleets broke formation, spreading across the sky in a pattern the Guardians had never seen before. It was not retreat. It was ritual. The enemy ships moved like pieces in a design that stretched across the heavens, a net woven of fire and shadow. Whatever they feared in the first world, they were not running from it. They meant to cage it. The Guardians realized too late what was happening. The enemy had not come simply to conquer. They had come prepared for this awakening, with weapons and machines not aimed at humanity, but at the planet itself. Their beams of light did not fall on cities anymore. They struck into the earth, into the glowing veins, as if trying to pull something out. The ground screamed. The sound was not natural. It rolled through stone and soil like the cry of something wounded. Entire mountains split, rivers boiled, and forests turned to ash in moments. The Guardians felt it in their bones. The first world was alive in a way none of them had ever believed, and the enemy was tearing into it like hunters cutting open a beast. Fear surged through every heart. If the planet was alive, if the first world had been watching, then what was it? A mind buried in stone? A machine older than stars? A prison holding something too dangerous to be freed? The Guardians had no answers. All they had was the sight of their home writhing under the enemy's assault, and the knowledge that if they failed here, the first world would not survive. One Guardian collapsed to his knees, clutching the soil as though he could shield it with his own body. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Hold on. Please hold on. We're still here." Others rallied beside him, raising weapons against the fleets that blotted out the sky. They were too small, too fragile, but their fire cut streaks of defiance into the heavens. Humanity would not watch in silence. Then came the second twist, the one none of them could have prepared for. From the light of the fissures, shapes began to rise. Not machines. Not ships. Figures. They were not human, yet they carried the outline of something painfully familiar. Tall, radiant forms carved from light and stone, faces shifting between calm and sorrow. They moved slowly as though waking from an endless sleep, their eyes glowing with the same fire that burned in the heart of the earth. The Guardians froze. Were these allies? Were these the creators of the first world's secret? Or were they something far worse, something the enemy had tried to keep buried? The enemy answered before humanity could. Their fleets fired in unison, striking the rising figures with weapons powerful enough to break continents. The figures staggered but did not fall. Their voices rang out across the air, not in words but in a resonance that pierced into every mind. The Guardians felt it like a memory, a call from something ancient, something that had seen humanity before humanity even existed. It was not comfort. It was not threat. It was recognition. The First World Guardians felt their hearts tear in two. If these beings were protectors, then humanity was not alone in guarding Earth. But if they were wardens, then the truth was far darker. Humanity had been living on a prison and the prisoners had just woken. The suspense deepened as the figures raised their arms, not against the enemy but against the planet itself. The glow intensified, rivers of fire spreading until half the world shone like a star. The Guardians stumbled back, choking on smoke, blinded by light, torn between awe and terror. One Guardian shouted into the chaos, his voice hoarse with desperation. "What are you?" But no answer came, only the thunder of stone breaking apart and the shriek of fleets diving lower to stop what was rising. The stakes were no longer survival of a species. They were survival of a world caught between two forces, each beyond comprehension. The First World was no longer simply Earth. It was battlefield, birthplace and something more, something none of them could yet name. Every breath grew heavier, every heartbeat louder. The Guardians pressed forward, knowing they could not turn back now. The fate of humanity, the truth of the First World, the very meaning of what it meant to fight, it was all balanced on the edge of this moment. And still, the question burned in every mind. Were they guarding their home, or guarding something buried within it that was never meant to be freed? The sky was fire. The fleets above the First World descended in full force, beams of light tearing into the ground, trying to rip the planet apart before its secret could rise. The newly awakened figures of light and stone stood against the storm, their bodies breaking under the barrage but refusing to fall. The Guardians, small and fragile in comparison, pressed forward anyway. They had no ships to match the enemy, no weapons to rival their power, but they had the one thing no one else carried: the will to fight for the First World, for home, for one another. The earth trembled as if caught between death and rebirth. Mountains collapsed, oceans rose in walls of water, and the fissures glowed so bright it was like staring into the heart of a star. Humanity had fought for survival before, but never against something so vast. The Guardians' lungs burned with smoke, their arms ached from endless battle, and still they refused to let go. One Guardian, covered in ash, lifted his weapon to the sky and fired into the darkness. It was nothing against the enemy's fleets, a spark against a storm, yet others followed. Across ruined cities, from broken fields and fractured bunkers, humanity answered with fire. They could not stop the fleets, but they could remind them that the First World was not undefended. Then came the breaking point. The figures of light staggered to their knees. Their voices rose louder, echoing into every mind, every soul. The Guardians felt words without language, a truth pressed into their hearts. The First World was not a prison. It was a cradle. Those beings were not wardens. They were protectors, left behind long before humanity, tasked with watching over the seed of a species that would one day rise. Humanity. The enemy knew it too. That was why they had come, to stop humanity from reaching this moment, to prevent them from claiming what had been waiting beneath their feet for ages. The Guardians' hearts pounded with fury and awe. Their world was not ordinary. Their fight had never been just for survival. They were standing on the birthplace of a legacy greater than they had imagined. The enemy unleashed their full strength, weapons bright enough to turn night into day. The figures of light shattered under the onslaught, fragments of stone and brilliance falling like meteors across the surface. Humanity screamed in despair, but in the falling pieces, something stirred. The fragments did not vanish. They sank into the earth, into rivers, into mountains, into the Guardians themselves. A surge of power tore through the planet, not mechanical, not alien, but alive. The Guardians felt it fill them, searing their veins, burning their lungs, but giving them strength beyond anything they had ever known. They were no longer only defenders. They had become the last bearers of the First World's gift. The fleets above hesitated for the first time. Their weapons faltered, their formation wavered. They had expected broken humans clinging to the dirt, not warriors carrying the fire of the planet itself. The Guardians raised their hands and from them, light burst upward, colliding with the enemy's weapons, tearing through ships like thunder through glass. The battle roared. Humanity did not just survive, they struck back. Every Guardian, every survivor who stood carried a piece of that fire. Their cries shook the sky, their defiance cracked the enemy's hold. The First World itself rose with them, the ground erupting in pillars of light that struck the fleets from below. But victory was not free. With every surge of power, the Guardians felt themselves fading. The gift they carried was not meant to last. It was the final breath of the First World's ancient protectors, burning bright before vanishing forever. The Guardians knew they were giving more than their strength. They were giving their lives. One by one they fell, their bodies consumed in light, their voices echoing into the storm. Yet for every Guardian who collapsed, another rose stronger, the fire spreading like a chain unbroken. Humanity did not falter. Humanity did not yield. The fleets began to break. One ship after another tore apart under the assault, falling in flames into the oceans below. The enemy for the first time turned to flee. They had underestimated the First World. They had underestimated those who called it home. And then, when the last of the fleets turned to retreat, the final twist came. The light beneath the planet did not fade. It grew. The Guardians who remained alive fell back in fear as the ground split open wider than ever before. From the depths, not stone, not figures, but something else emerged. A voice filled the air, vast and patient, older than the stars. It was not the fragments of the protectors. It was the First World itself. For the first time the planet spoke. Not in words, but in a pulse of thought that every human understood. It had given them its gift, but not without purpose. The Guardians had proven they could fight, could love, could stand. But the voice carried a final truth that froze every heart. The First World was not only theirs. It had been waiting not just for humanity to rise, but for the day when humanity would leave. The fire spread across the continents, reaching into the skies, stretching toward the stars. It was not an ending. It was a command. Humanity was no longer bound to a single world. The First World had awakened them, given them its legacy, but now it was time to go beyond, to carry its fire into the dark. The Guardians stood trembling, torn between triumph and sorrow. They had won the battle. They had driven the enemy away. But their victory came with the knowledge that Earth, their First World, was changing forever. It would not remain the same cradle it had been. It had given them everything, and now it demanded that they take that gift to the stars. Tears burned in their eyes as they looked at the soil beneath their feet, the rivers, the ruins, the graves of those they loved. This was their home, their beginning, their heart. And now it was asking them to leave. The fleets were gone. The skies were quiet. But the First World pulsed with light, alive, waiting. Humanity had defended it, had proven itself worthy of the fire. Now came the harder question: could they carry that fire without losing themselves? The Guardians lowered their heads, their chests aching with grief and pride. They had become something greater, but they had also lost much. The war was over, but the journey was only beginning. The First World had survived. Humanity had survived. But as the light dimmed and silence returned, one truth echoed in every heart: the guardianship of Earth was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning of something far greater, something written not just in soil and stone, but in the stars themselves. And as the last glow faded, the Guardians stood together, staring into the vast night sky, knowing that the greatest battles, and the greatest truths, still waited beyond the horizon. The silence after the storm was heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. The skies above the First World were calmer now, though faint scars of fire and smoke still clung to the horizon. Where the battle had raged, where the First World Guardians had stood their ground against an enemy determined to unmake them, there was only a quiet that felt both fragile and profound. People moved slowly among the ruins, their steps careful, as if afraid that even the smallest noise would undo the fragile peace that had finally arrived. For the survivors, it was not only the ending of a war but the ending of a chapter of existence itself. They had stood on the edge of being forgotten, yet somehow they endured. Humanity had not broken. Humanity had not bowed. And the First World Guardians had become a symbol far greater than anyone could have imagined when their story first began. Even those who had once doubted whether the fight was worth the cost could now see it. The Guardians weren't just soldiers, they weren't just leaders. They had become something that lived inside every human heart. They were proof that even when the stars themselves turned against them, humanity's will could not be erased. The ruins around them told stories of sacrifice. Places that once thrived with laughter now stood in silence, waiting for new life to return. The Guardians walked among their people, no longer carrying only the burden of war but the responsibility of guiding what came after. There were tears, there was grief, but woven through it all was the quiet fire of hope. The First World Guardians had not only defended their planet, they had reminded humanity of its own strength. People who had once felt small in the face of endless stars now looked up at the sky with new eyes. The war had scarred them, but it had also forged something unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, survivors began to rebuild. It was not easy. Every step forward carried the weight of memories, of friends who would never return, of homes that would never be the same. Yet still people moved forward. Children played in the shadows of broken towers, their laughter carrying through the ruins like a promise that life always found a way. Families came together to share food, to share stories, to remember that even in loss, they were not alone. The Guardians became symbols not only of survival but of what came next. They were sought after not for orders of war anymore, but for words of healing. People turned to them not because they carried weapons but because they carried hope. The legend of the First World Guardians spread far beyond their world. Other colonies, once fractured and distant, began to listen. They began to unite. What had been broken across the stars was slowly being tied together again by the simple truth of humanity's resilience. And yet, beneath the rebuilding, beneath the newfound hope, there remained the question that had haunted them since the beginning. Why had the enemy chosen this world? Why had the First World, above all others, been marked for destruction? The answers were partial, fragments left in broken transmissions and shattered records. Some said the First World held a secret older than humanity itself, something the enemy had feared. Others believed it was simply because the First World was where humanity had first stood tall, and to erase it would have meant erasing everything they were. The Guardians themselves did not have every answer, but they understood something deeper. The enemy had underestimated what it meant to face humanity. They thought that destroying buildings, tearing through defenses, and breaking armies would end the fight. What they had not expected was the unshakable will of people who refused to surrender. That was the true heart of the First World Guardians, not in their weapons, not in their tactics, but in the unyielding bond between them and the people they swore to protect. The final twist of it all came not from the enemy's return, but from the discovery left in the ashes. In the ruins of one of the strongholds, hidden deep beneath layers of stone and steel, the Guardians found records, not written by humans but by something else. Records of watchers who had been observing the First World since long before humanity had risen on its soil. These records spoke of a prophecy, of a time when the First World would rise against the darkness, not just for itself but for countless others across the galaxy. The Guardians realized then that their story had always been larger than themselves. They were not only fighting for their world, they were fighting for every world that looked to them as a sign that survival was possible. Humanity, in its raw defiance and stubborn spirit, had become the answer to a question written long before their birth. As these truths spread, the legend of the First World Guardians grew. No longer were they seen only as defenders of one world, but as the fire that could light the way for countless others. The scars of war remained, but they were no longer marks of defeat. They were proof of endurance, proof that humanity could rise from anything. The Guardians gathered with the people one last time in the heart of the ruined city. There, under the broken sky that had once burned with fire, they spoke words that would echo for generations. They promised that the sacrifices made would not be forgotten, that the story of the First World would live on in every voice that carried it forward. One Guardian raised their hand to the stars, not in defiance this time but in promise. Humanity would not only rebuild but expand. They would take the strength learned from this war and carry it into the future. They would protect not just themselves but any who stood on the edge of being silenced. And as the people listened, as the weight of grief turned slowly into the strength of unity, something remarkable happened. The fear that had once held them was replaced with determination. The future, uncertain as it was, no longer felt like a shadow. It felt like an open path. The First World Guardians had won more than a war. They had won back the soul of their people. They had reminded humanity that even against impossible odds, they were never powerless. They had shown that strength was not in the stars, but in the human heart that refused to yield. In the end, the First World stood not as a ruin but as a beginning. It stood as the place where humanity faced its greatest trial and emerged stronger. The Guardians, though scarred, carried that story within them, knowing it would be told long after they were gone. And so the story closed not with silence but with voices, with the sound of people rebuilding, with laughter returning to streets once filled with fear, with songs sung under skies that no longer threatened to fall. Humanity had survived. Humanity had endured. Humanity had become more than it had ever believed it could be. The First World Guardians would forever be remembered, not just as protectors of their world, but as symbols of what humanity was capable of when it stood together. Their story was no longer just theirs, it belonged to everyone who carried the fire forward. And as the stars stretched above them, vast and endless, humanity looked upward not with dread but with promise. The future was theirs to claim, and the first world would always be the place where it all began.